We are waiting, actually, as a commission for the president's comments to come to us April 1st. And that already will have an impact on how Congress reacts to all this. We've testified, very enthusiastic Senate Armed Services Committee. By the way, both D's and R's. It was quite remarkable. In fact, a couple of the senators remarked, why couldn't Congress be as bipartisan as we were? I'm not going to go there. The House, a little more cautious, primarily, I think, because they're more sensitive to some of the veterans groups, which ties in with particularly one aspect of one of our 15 recommendations, which is the health care recommendation. I'll walk you through the two big ones, retirement and health care. We can talk about some of the others, if you like, later on. Retirement, we're grandfathering everybody. Let's start with that. We also accepted as a baseline the 20-year retirement approach. We also accepted, in principle, the idea of defined benefit, which the rest of the country's moved away from. But, you know, not the rest of the country isn't necessarily risking their necks every day for 20 years. What we did was cut back. Right now, basically, if you retire after 20 years, they do 2.5% per year. You get 50% retirement. We moved it back to 2% per year, so that's 40%. And what we added was the equivalent of the thrift savings plan that the civilians have. Now, roughly 40% of the active military already participate in that plan, even though there's no government match. We are proposing a government match. We're proposing automaticity. We're proposing up to 5% of your pay in the government match. It's a really good deal. We also tie that in with the proposed changes in the GI Bill. We want to sunset the Montgomery GI Bill. By the way, you pay $1,200 a year for that. With the 9/11 bill that you don't pay for at all, it's a better deal. And the change that we make there, and the reason I say it ties in with the retirement, is one of the things we wanted to ensure is that the force profile stays the same, both retention and recruitment. And we were able to work that. Rand did the studies for us. Right now, if you are there 6 years and commit to 4 more in service, then you can transfer your education benefits to your family. We changed that to 10 and 2. Stick around 10 years. At that point, you're eligible, if you give 2 more years, to transfer that benefit. That's a fantastic benefit. It goes to what Mackenzie was talking about in terms of the different nature of our force today. You know, when I got into this business 150 years ago, there were basically young single men in the military. Full stop. Now, of course, it's totally different. You've got women, you've got families with children. Priorities have really changed. Child care becomes very important, and this education benefit is huge for them. If you stick around 10, and then after 2 you're eligible, we also, going back to the retirement side, offer a new bonus, a continuation bonus, if you stick around 4 more years. So stay there 12, pick up the bonus. Now you're in for 16, then 20 isn't all that far away. And that helps to maintain the force profile. With the government matching your contributions, and you have to opt out, you wind up well ahead than you are today, and it reflects the changing environment that involves everybody in terms of how they look at retirement. But again, we wanted to protect part of that defined benefit precisely because the military is in many ways unique. The healthcare side, we wanted basically to get rid of Tricare, other than Tricare for Life. Tricare for Life, as you know, is the wraparound. You're eligible for Medicare, and that still doesn't cover everything. Tricare for Life covers the rest. But for a lot of people, what Tricare offers isn't all that hot. And the reason is DOD, in its own subtle way, has been renegotiating the Tricare contracts, and the benefits keep shrinking. And the idea is to save money. we created a plan that's very similar to what the civil servants have, the FEHBP. There, anybody who's been in the government, been a civil servant, no, you get dozens of these plans to choose from. And you can choose the plan that is most appropriate to your particular circumstances. Now, if you've got chronic diseases in the family, that's covered under a separate pot of money, so that doesn't really affect it. But what this does is it gives you choice. And we propose a new allowance, a health care allowance that comes in addition to the government paying the premiums for families. Remember, the military person goes to the military treatment facility, that's not an issue. That continues. It's for the families. And this is different from the civil servant side because the plans have to include the possibility of going to the military treatment facilities for families. So now families have real choice. You choose a plan that suits you. You can go to the military treatment facility. And oh, by the way, you also get this basic allowance for health care, which is a sum of money that, hey, if you don't spend it on health care, you keep it. And what that does is get people to focus on things like wellness, which right now the Tricare system doesn't even take account of. We call this thing Tricare Choice. And the whole idea, whether it's on the retirement side, on the healthcare side, and a lot of other areas, is to give the modern service person choice. They're different. And, you know, in combat, they're being treated differently, right? They have tremendous independence. They get information from all sorts of places. They make choices. And yet, in the care of families, the care and treatment of our personnel, we're still very paternalistic. So we moved away from that. There are obviously 13 others. One example of, again, how things tie together, we want to give people financial literacy. They don't get it today. You know, you take an 18, 19-year-old kid, comes in, gets fire hosed for 4 hours, but, you know, busy doodling or whatever, you know, and doesn't know a thing. Well, if you're going to make choices about staying in, about health care, about what kind of retirement, about how to invest your thrift savings plan of monies, then you really need to be financially literate. Now, other militaries do that. We had the Australians come in and tell us about what they do. It can't be just some sergeant who sees this as a collateral duty to get over with in one day who's telling you about financial literacy. And you don't want the young people to be ripped off by the loan sharks and other types that basically go after particularly younger people's money as soon as they get their paychecks. So that's just another example of how this all ties together. What's going to happen? Again, let's see what the White House does. The president has to comment. He's getting comments from DOD as I speak. Let's see how they react to all this, because that's going to affect whether the veterans organizations have a louder voice, or those who look after the active duty have a louder voice, you know, how Congress is going to behave and so on. So that's one area. We're very, very hopeful. We think you can read the recommendations on the web. You can read the report on the web, draw your own conclusions about it. But we polled, by the way, hundreds of thousands of active, reserve, and retireds to see what they thought of. It was a draft of our plan. Obviously, we weren't done yet. But we wanted to have a feel whether we were on the right track. 80% thought that our proposals, the package that they saw, was pretty good and liked it. That was of the active. And to me, the active, with all due respect, active and reserve are what count. And by the way, with the reserves, not to denigrate the veterans, but the veterans are coming from a different place, a different time, and we've got to think ahead. So we don't want to undermine what we're doing for our vets, and we have recommendations about VA, DOD cooperation, some of the things that, you know, it just blows your mind how these things go on. You know, the suicide rate for vets is huge. But the DOD formularies aren't the same as the VA formularies. So some person who's got PTSD, who's getting some treatment while they're in active service, they then go to retire, they go to the VA, and the doc says, well, I can't give you that one. That's the worst thing you can do to a veteran. So it's not like we diminish the importance of the veterans at all. Now, I didn't mention a thing about money yet. And, you know, I was on this commission in part because I was comptroller. In fact, one of the things they used me for was to see whether our new health care plan, as we proposed it, could be rated by DOD comptroller the way it has been in the past. So I kept trying to figure out ways to undermine the plan until I cried uncle, and that's why we came up with what we came up with. Our proposals will save on balance about $12 billion a year. Not huge bucks, but not trivial dollars either. And you have to look at that in addition to the other potential savings that you've just heard discussed to see that you can talk about significant dollars if it all added up. Now, you heard about BRAC. The administration has come back essentially with the same, did come back with virtually the same proposals they made last fiscal year. Not just about that, about Apaches and reserves, about getting rid of mothballing cruisers, you know, A-10s you've heard about. The interesting thing, of course, is when they said this was last year and we're coming back this year, is they actually came back 8 weeks after Congress had acted. So last year wasn't last year. Last year was 8 weeks before. Now, I don't know, maybe some people changed their minds over 8 weeks, probably if they lost the election, but then it doesn't matter. So I wouldn't stake the family farm on BRAC or on most of these changes. You would save significant bucks on BRAC, clearly. You could save significant dollars in acquisition. I testified in front of Chairman Thornberry when he was having his acquisition hearings. One of the things that concerns me is not just the number of civil servants, and I think McKenzie's done wonderful work on that, and I'll come back to that momentarily, but the actual knowledge of these civil servants. You can, if you're in the military, you have a thing called professional military education. You can't move up the chain unless you're educated. War college, staff and command college, all that. You can get your master's in physics, go into the government, and never take another course for 40 years. Now, if you think about how Moore's law relates to that, you begin to see that we have an uneducated workforce, at best an undereducated workforce. So we need not only to deal with the number of civil servants, but the quality. These are bright people, but there's no mandating of their going out or spending a year in industry and learning how industry works, or going out to a business school and getting a business degree. Some of them are self-motivated. But very often the ones who leave come back and the boss says, well, there's no job for you, even though there's supposed to be a job for you. So we need an educated workforce as well. Otherwise, all the reforms aren't going to work anyway. In terms of numbers, here's how DOD plays this game. It's not a new game. The great Doc Cook came up with it years ago. You know, I'll tell you the Doc Cook story, and then I'll tell you what DOD's doing, then I'll sit down and shut up. Years ago, Congress wanted to cut OSD. So they passed legislation to cut OSD. So now all of a sudden you had all these thousands of civil servants that were being cut. What did Doc Cook do? And he was a genius. He created White House Services. Totally new agency, and everybody went into White House Services. Nobody was cut. White House Services is still there today, WHS. If you look at what's happened with personnel, McKenzie's right, but not entirely right. Yes, we've cut people. Well, actually, you said we haven't, and that's the right part. We actually have cut 74,000 people in the last few years from the Army, Navy, and Air Force, civilians. They all went to defense-wide. The fourth estate that nobody understands, nobody looks at, nobody ever cuts. And in fact, the projections are, I think it's another 16,000 civilians are going to be added over the next couple of years. And what Ken Calvert, who's pushing legislation to cut 15% of the civilian workforce over the next few years, keeps arguing, and rightly so, is, okay, we've added some 70 to 80,000 civilians over the, since 2001, and we've cut the military significantly. Have the civilians made DOD more efficient? Anybody who believes that, please raise your hand right now. That's what I figured. And so we have an imperative here, because it's not only the defense civilians. You got another, I think, 600,000 contractors. the ratio is so much worse than if the Japanese really understood how bad the ratio was. The tooth to tail ratio, if you call tooth anybody wearing a uniform and tail anybody wearing a suit, is roughly 1 to 1. That is pretty unbelievable.